Last year, in the summer of 2013, I had an amazing opportunity to travel to Hong Kong, Taiwan, and mainland China. The purpose of my trip was to teach ESL to a group of middle school students. I was very surprised at my experience at how different the educational system is in East Asia. From this, I was motivated to do a research interest in the philosophy and the comparative education and what can we learn from East Asia. My research interest will focus on Japan, China, Vietnam, Korea, and Singapore. My area of study for this research is going to be Japan, China, Vietnam, Korea, and Singapore. I'm going to compare what we as Canadian educators from the Western world can learn from these countries and what are some of the great things that we can take away from their educational system. Start by giving a historical background on some of the mentioned countries and how similar and also how different they are amongst each other. I will start by giving a historical context on the education in Japan. Education in Japan began in the 7th century. It developed a writing style based on Chinese characters and imported many texts of Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism, all while developing its own religion of Shintoism. In the period known as Meiji Enlightenment, which took place from 1868 to 1912, Japan began to introduce Western education models to achieve rapid modernization. There are entrance exams that are referred to as examination halls that are done in order to get accepted into a university in Japan. There are intense pressures of these competitive examinations for entry into the top universities in the country. By the late 19th century, Japan had its own schooling system. After defeat in the Second World War, Japan was occupied by the American military for 7 years, in which a new constitution was passed in 1947 that committed to decentralized education. Under American influence, the education system became less hierarchical and provision was made for a majority of young people to complete secondary education and for an increasingly large percentage to enter higher education. The main direction of post-war reforms in education was to reduce central control over the educational system and give greater autonomy to teachers and greater responsibility to local educational authorities. Japan was the first Asian society to achieve mass higher education in the same time as the United States, Canada, and Soviet Union, and were all well ahead of other Western European nations. It is extremely competitive and difficult to obtain a teaching position in Japan, as only 20% of applicants receive a full-time job. Teachers have a very high social status and remuneration that is 40% higher than other public employees with equivalent qualifications. Next, I will talk about education in mainland China and Taiwan. In 1911, when the last imperial dynasty was overthrown, China's leaders tried to emulate Japan in creating a modern educational state. At this time, hundreds of Chinese teachers studied in Japan, and there was a strong belief that the Japanese model would enable China to absorb Western science and technology. After 1911, China launched itself on a journey of change that involved radical experimentation with a range of Western models of education. Efforts were made to lay a foundation of basic education to develop a number of academic secondary schools that would open up entry into a few newly established universities. An educational law of 1922 adopted American patterns of decentralized educational administration and community responsibility for schools. Following the successful communist revolution of 1949, China's education developed in an entirely different direction than that of Japan and Taiwan. Chinese communist leaders turned to the Soviet Union for advice and help, which meant that the educational system was reformed in the 1950s to follow Soviet patterns with a strong emphasis was placed on basic education for all. Next, I will go into and talk about the globalization of education. There are remarkable similarities in educational processes and outcomes when it comes to the eight Confucian societies in East Asia. Children from East Asian societies tend to have high educational achievement in international tests of mathematics, science, and language knowledge. East Asian societies have experienced capitalism, socialism, and colonialism, and have had diverse interactions with France, Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union. These historical experiences influence their educational systems, yet the most explanatory factors are rooted still in Confucian philosophy. What can we learn from East Asia? Well, Harold Stevenson and James Stingler undertook a huge study to see the difference between Asian and American students. Asian students spend more time in school. Asian students go to school 25% more days than American students. Asian teachers tend to stay with one class for 2 or 3 years so that they build close links with the children's families. Asian students spend 2 hours a week more on homework than American children. Asian classrooms tend to have much more students than those in the United States. Teachers and parents have a belief in East Asia that with effort every child can learn successfully. Asian parents have regard doing well in school as the single most important thing for a child, where American parents seek to balance academic achievement with others, such as part-time jobs and athletic performance, or dance class. Asian countries consider a national curriculum extremely important for standard setting. The following are some of my views on Asian education. So from my experience from teaching in Asia, and specifically Taiwan and China in the past 2 summers, I've noticed that the classes are much bigger. So a regular Chinese classroom can have anywhere up to 50 students in it. There's also larger emphasis to learning from a textbook. There is much more homework where students want to do homework, where when the teacher does not give students homework, parents will come to school and ask why that student is not getting homework, because they will not be prepared for their entrance exam either into high school or into university. There is less emphasis on discussion in a classroom, as the teacher lectures the class while the students take notes. There is also very little participation by students, unless otherwise asked by the teacher to answer a question. This can also be due to the large class sizes. There is a community-valued education, as education is seen as a very important aspect of growing up, and teachers demand and want respect and receive this respect from the teacher, from other teachers, from the parents, and the students themselves. There's a lot more pressure on students to do well, and parents are much more involved in their day-to-day homework and other studies.